What explains the black-white wealth gap? African Americans, Native Americans, and Latinxs have less than 10% of the wealth whites have. In 2016, the average white family had over $170,000 in net worth, whereas the average black family had about $17,000 in net worth. Net worth is the total of all of our assets, minus any debts we have. How can we explain these racial disparities in wealth? Social scientists Thomas Shapiro, Tatiana Machete, and Sam Osoro conducted a study based on 1,700 households and found that the wealth gap between black and white families tripled between 1984 and 2009. They not only measured the size and growth of the wealth gap, but also were able to identify the causes of the increase in the wealth gap over time. You might think the wealth gap is due to the fact that black and white people spend their money in different ways. However, they found that wealth differentials are not due to consumption patterns or rates of savings, as those patterns do not vary by race. You might also think that the wealth gap is due to income differentials. Black people do earn less than whites. However, income differentials are only part of the explanation for the wealth gap. Shapiro and his colleagues used their data not only to show us how big the wealth gap is, but also what explains it. They found that 2/3 of the wealth gap between whites and blacks can be explained by 5 factors: years of home ownership, household income, years of unemployment, college education, and inheritances or financial support from family members. Years of home ownership accounted for 27% of the wealth gap, household income for 20%, unemployment for 9%, and college education and inheritances for 5% each. Shapiro and his colleagues found that they could explain 27% of the gap between whites and blacks by looking at the average years of home ownership, making this the primary driver of the wealth gap. White families purchase homes and start accumulating home equity an average 8 years earlier than black families. White families are able to purchase homes at a younger age than black families because they are more likely to receive family assistance for their down payment. Overall, white families are 5 times as likely as black families to receive an inheritance. When white families own homes, their wealth multiplies faster than black families because homes in white neighborhoods increase in value more rapidly. White families also have more wealth in their home than black families because white borrowers pay lower interest rates than black borrowers, allowing them to pay their loans down at a quicker rate. The less money you owe on your mortgage, the more home equity you have. And home equity is the primary source of wealth for most families in the United States. Finally, the home ownership rate for white families is 28% higher than it is for black families. The second most important explanation for the wealth gap is household income, which accounts for 20% of the difference. It's logical to think that income would have a direct impact on wealth, and it does. However, this impact varies by race. Shapiro and his colleagues found that every dollar increase in average income for white families added $5.19 in wealth. In contrast, a $1 increase in income for black families added just 69 cents of wealth. Whereas white families are often able to use their income to build their wealth, black families are more likely to have to draw on their savings to cover emergencies for themselves and their family members. The fact that Black workers are twice as likely as white workers to experience unemployment accounted for 9% of the wealth gap. The fact that white families are more likely to receive inheritances accounted for 5% of the wealth gap. And differences in rates of college education accounted for another 5%. Homeownership, income, college education, and inheritances are the foundation of middle-class status in the United States. The government has thus provided significant tax savings in these areas to support the growth of middle-class families. Closing the wealth gap will require restructuring tax and housing policies. It also will require strengthening and enforcing anti-discrimination policies, such that people of color no longer face barriers in accessing housing and employment. Government policies played a role in creating the wealth gap between Black and white people, and they certainly can play a role in closing it.